Hello everyone, my name is Derek and welcome to the Netflix Knowhow, the review show here to help you stop browsing and AniMay! I know, it's been 2 weeks since my Death Note movie review, it's the middle of June now, the pun doesn't work anymore. But you know what? My show, my rules.
Whatever, I'll do what I want.
Alright, here we go, Death Note anime review, let's do it! Death Note is about a high school student named Light Yagami who comes into possession of a magical notebook called a Death Note that grants him the power to essentially kill anyone whose name he writes in it. What does he do with this power? He becomes a psychotic serial killer hellbent on creating a new world where he's God. Unfortunately for Light, however, there is a super detective named L who is hellbent on capturing this serial killer and bringing him to justice. Death Note is awesome. The premise is awesome, the characters are awesome, the story is awesome, everything about this show is awesome. I thought this was going to be a sort of darker, gorier show centered around Ryuk, who I imagined to be this really badass demon character that ruled the underworld, but that's not at all what the show is. It is instead a very, very well done character study that centers on the relationship between Light and the detective L. Light and L are both immensely fascinating characters because they are essentially the same people, they just happen to exist at extreme opposite ends of the morality spectrum, one being good and one being evil. And they're both really super smart, they are brilliant. It's kind of like watching a really tense Sherlock Holmes story, except this time the story is told from the perspective of the villain Moriarty, and it's great. I've always really liked stories that focus on the villains because I happen to find them much more fascinating than hero characters a lot of the times, and I think they're just a character archetype that is really overlooked. I mean, one of my favorite shows ever is Dexter, and that is a show that is entirely focused on a psychotic serial killer and how he has to cope with these urges that he has. So I really like that Death Note focuses on a villain character in Light Yagami, who is completely delusional and absolutely psychotic, but he's really interesting. I think it's absolutely fascinating to see what a character like this does when he's given that kind of power and the sort of mental backflips that he goes through to justify the awful things that he does. But as interesting as Light Yagami is, the detective character, L, is so much more fascinating to me. He is brilliant with his logic and reasoning and deduction capabilities to the point where he almost comes off as feeling like he's psychic because he is constantly right about everything. He figures everything out almost immediately, and he knows that he's right. He knows that he has things figured out. But because he is working under the restraints of the law, he can't prove anything, and it's driving him nuts throughout the entire series. It is endlessly entertaining to watch this L character go from this well-composed genius to someone who is slowly going insane because they just can't prove what they need to prove even though they know they are right, and he just copes by stuffing his face full of cake and sitting in chairs weird. He's just so interesting and bizarre. But of course, we can't talk about Death Note unless we talk about the Shinigami Ryuk. A quick briefing for those of you who don't know, a Shinigami in Japanese culture is one of the death gods, or the people that is responsible for taking the lives of humans. So when I went into this show, I was thinking that Ryuk was gonna be this like really dark and brooding and intimidating ominous force that drives the show forward, but that's not even close to what he is. He's really more just like a really sadistic goofball who is just having a great time watching all of this chaos ensue because of the death notes that he left behind on Earth. He's always pointing out how Light Yagami and the other human characters that exist on Earth are so interesting, which I think is a really blunt and elegant way of summing up his character, because that's really what the show is. It's just interesting to watch these characters and see what they do and the decisions that they make. The show also delves a little bit into the Shinigami world itself and how it's set up and what's going on with it, and I think that this exploration of it was really well done, and I actually found it to be a very interesting world. It turns out that the Shinigami are actually just really sad people that are slowly dying, and the only reason that they do what they do is because they're afraid of death. They don't want to die, and so they just exist in this miserable state of being for their entire lives. There is another main Shinigami in the show who shows up named Rem, and she is a really nice contrast to Ryuk's character. They're both very dry and deadpan characters, but whereas Ryuk is more sort of like a jokester character that's just enjoying watching the show with a bucket of popcorn, Rem is actually one that seems to be a little more invested and cares about the interactions of the humans a little more. It's nice to see this contrast between the two personalities because it shows that the Shinigami are all different and they all have different driving motivations behind their characters. And since I brought up the fact that there is another Shinigami that shows up in this show, I suppose that could be a minor spoiler that yes, there is more than one Death Note that exists in this world. I won't get into too much details about it, obviously, because I don't want to give anything away, but I found it really interesting and a really good touch because it gives some perspective on what it would be like if another person were to get one of these notebooks and how they would use that power. There is also another character in the show named Misa, and she honestly is kind of problematic for me. On a personal level, she's really loud and really obnoxious, and I just generally didn't like her being around all that much. I enjoyed the show a lot more when she wasn't constantly butting in and running her mouth and just being generally annoying. But on top of that, she also has this obsession to Light to the point where she is completely submissive to his every will. And it just came off being a little misogynistic and off-putting for me personally. I understand that this is probably the result of the differences between Japanese and Western culture, and this is just kind of how things are over there, I get that. But as the only main female character in the show, I was just kind of disappointed that she wasn't a stronger character with more assertive attitudes and just more to do, I guess. Her character really only exists to be subservient to Light, and it works in the show, it's just not the greatest thing they could have done with that character. The story is absolutely gripping from beginning to end, and you are going to be on the edge of your seat in every episode as things progress further and further and further. It's basically like watching a giant intense chess match between Light Yagami and the detective L, and as soon as one of them gets the upper hand, the other one immediately counters, and they're just constantly going back and forth and getting closer and closer and closer to capturing one another. It's crazy because they end up getting so immensely close to one another and they're literally this far away from just taking the other person out, but there's always one thing that's holding them back and they can't do it, otherwise their whole plan falls apart. What's really awesome is that they even end up becoming unlikely friends with one another because they are very similar in terms of their personalities and their cognitive abilities, but they're also secret enemies at the same time. It's crazy. There was a point about halfway through the show where the story kind of took a weird detour though, and I didn't really like it all that much, at least not initially. Basically what happens is that Light puts himself into a situation where he ends up helping L search for someone, and then he tries to frame another person as the serial killer, and I just didn't think it worked that great, just because it felt like all the momentum that had been building up to that point was just stopped. And now we're suddenly focusing on this completely different story that doesn't really have to do with what we were watching before. It basically felt like a filler arc in the sense that you knew eventually we were going to get past this and get back to the main story, but we just had to slog our way through this to get to it. Still, by the end of this little story detour, I was genuinely invested in the ending to it, and I was really excited to see how it was all going to end. Death Note does also fall victim to that anime tendency to just rely on exposition a little too much, at least for Western standards. I do also think the show runs a bit long, and they could have easily trimmed out at least 10 to 12 episodes worth of content and just had a really strong, focused story instead of having one that had a tendency to meander in parts. Don't get me wrong, it's not like the story was all over the place and they weren't constantly making progress, but it just didn't need to be as long as it actually was. But even with the length and the little detour in the middle, I still found myself incredibly entertained and excited and on the edge of my seat and wanting to see everything that was going to happen. So I could talk more and more and more about how great this show is and how cool the characters are and the awesome story, but honestly, I'm gonna stop right there because to really experience it, you just need to go watch it. It's just fantastic. You need to sit down, watch it, and enjoy it for yourself. It is a truly fantastic show with an original and interesting concept, a truly engaging story, fascinating characters, and just good stuff all around. It's great. Death Note is a masterwork of the exploration between good and evil and the fine line that rests somewhere in between there. The humans who made this must be so interesting. Thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I apologize for taking so long to get the Death Note anime review out. There's a reason for that, but I will be posting about that in another video. So in the meantime, it's Terrifyingly, the Death Note anime review. It was fantastic, absolutely worth the wait. If you haven't seen it already, go watch it. It is so good. I highly recommend it. Anyway, if you guys enjoy this content, be sure to hit that subscribe button down below and share it with all your friends. I would really appreciate that. You can also head over to Twitter and over to Facebook and follow me on there. And as always, if you want to know your flicks, you know where to click. Happy hunting, guys. I'll see you next time.